Welcome to your classroom coffee break. I'm John Van Dusen, a long-term teacher, coach, and Army officer. And in this episode, we're going to talk about how to approach a boring curriculum. Now, I get this question all the time because I teach probably the most boring class that anybody thinks they could have, and that is history. But even if you're teaching a more dynamic class, we've all looked in the textbook or we've all looked at the standards at some point and thought to ourselves, man, how can I make this engaging? How can I make this exciting? How can I make this so students are actually going to like it? So that's what we're going to talk about today. First, let's talk about why some curriculums feel boring, even if they're not. So the first reason might be a lack of relevance, where the students just cannot see where this would possibly fit into their everyday life. And being a history teacher, I hear this one all the time. I am blessed in that I teach U.S. history and we cover the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and a bunch of reforms that happened in the 1800s. So I'm able to relate those things back to everyday life, specifically when it comes to elections and treaties and those types of things. But when students are learning things about biology or chemistry or math or ancient history, they may see a lack of relevance. And how is this even going to help me? And the one thing I can always point to is if we don't understand history, we're bound to repeat its mistakes. So maybe that's something you can use in your classroom too. So another reason would be an overemphasis on just rote learning. And I think back to the days of the old time test where you'd have the column of 2 times 2, 2 times 3, 2 times 4, 2 times 5, all the way through and all the way down. And although there is a time and a place for that type of learning, if that is something that is overemphasized, if we're simply overemphasizing vocabulary words and dates and people, then those types of things can make your curriculum super boring. So a third reason your curriculum might seem boring is it might be you. You might be stuck in a one-size-fits-all type of teaching method, something you might have been doing for years. And maybe it's something that you just need to mix it up. Maybe it's your energy coming off that this is a little boring because you've done the same thing for years after years. So maybe it's something where you need to look at yourself and adjust how you're teaching. Now, maybe not, but maybe it's something you could do. And if you're trying something new and having fun with it, maybe your students will too. So now let's talk about how to make boring curriculum engaging. We've just identified what could make it boring, but now let's talk about how to make it engaging. And this first one is the one I use all the time, and that is connecting to real world applications. And I do that a lot with my history, specifically talking about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And especially when we come in on an election year, or if there's a controversial bill going through the House or the Senate, when we're talking about treaties. And I will tell you, the first part of 2025 has been rich with things that we are able to connect to real world applications and the Constitution. But any way you can show students how this connects to their real life, and you can use math in connecting it to budgeting, especially if you're teaching middle schoolers. I have a lot of 8th graders that are looking to get jobs this summer, or maybe already have jobs, and it's a great way to bring up taxes. It's a great way to talk up minimum wage and different types of jobs, hours worked, tips. Tips is a great one. And we've been having a lot of great conversations with, there's a lot of talk about no tax on tips. So we talk about what does that mean and how would that affect someone who works, say they work as a server and they make $4 an hour from the restaurant, but then they collect a bunch of tips. So there's different ways that you can make the topic relevant. And those are just two, with using U.S. history, linking it back to the Constitution, taking math, all different types of math things that kids are going to be interested in because it's going to be right up their alley. Other things you can use are video games. I know Minecraft is a huge one. We use fantasy football in the fall. We're going to do March Madness as we come up here for our sports fans. And if you have students that aren't sports fans, they can still have fun with the math. And it's still something that's a little bit different. So in general, it kind of cuts out that boredom. So a second way to make it less boring kind of fits in with the first, and that's incorporate student interests. And I go back to that route learning. When I taught sixth grade math, I used to do a ton of time tests. We'd do one every day, which can get super boring. However, at the end of the time test, we also had a game where we would figure out the percentage of shots made in the trash can. So we would set the trash can out, and back then it was all flip it up and yell Kobe. And then we would take that lesson and just turn it into another lesson on fractions and percentages. So any way that you can incorporate your students' interest, whether that's sports, whether that's video games, it could be reading, it could be drawing, anything you can do to help bring their life into the curriculum is going to help you make it less boring. So a third way to make your curriculum less boring is to use active learning techniques. And this means more than just getting students up out of their seats and moving around, which I am a huge fan of. I do all the time. That one can backfire a little bit if the content is really boring, because those students will get up in those groups and they'll just talk about other things. So you really have to monitor what they're talking about and how long you give them to talk about that particular thing. I'm reminded back to, again, sixth grade math, and I did a kind of a semester long program in where I would give them a paycheck every Friday, but they would have to pay rent to stay in their seats. Now, this was not real money. It was just on a spreadsheet, but I also made small checks because 10, 15 years ago, checks were still a thing. Not many people use checks anymore, but they would have to write out a check for rent payment for me. And then after a certain amount of time, they were able to buy their desk. I think it was for $500. Well, once they bought their desk, now they had to start paying utilities. Then they had to start paying taxes. I had students that were actually saving up enough money. They were buying other people's desks and charging them rent. So this little project, this active learning technique, took something that could be super boring, like taxes and rent and interest rates, and made it super engaging. And I had students all over the map. Some were becoming like real estate tycoons, and some barely had enough money at the end of the week to pay their rent. So anything you can do to make it an active learning environment is going to take your curriculum and take away that boring level. And the last technique I'm going to tell you about for making your boring curriculum a little less boring is make it a story. When I was in Afghanistan, I was able to take a course called the International Criminal Investigation Training Assistant Program. And basically it was how to investigate crimes that are happening in, at this time it was Kabul, Afghanistan. And one of the biggest things that we were told is a lot of people could not read, so all of their lessons were told by stories. So if you're trying to teach a certain way of how to manage a police department, you couldn't just go bullet point by bullet point on a PowerPoint slide because they couldn't read it. You had to make it into a story. And that got me thinking that most of our ancient lessons are taught through stories. And some examples of that would be the Bible. That's all stories and parables. Aesop's fables are all stories that teach us a certain lesson. And this is something you can do in your classroom. And I've used this technique on my Bill of Rights quiz. When I do my Bill of Rights quiz, it starts off with Fred just robbed a bank. And as I go through the story, Fred hides the money in his car. He has to get searched by the police. There's a protest in Fred's favor. While the police are searching, they find a firearm in his house. And I use that story of Fred robbing the bank to go through all of the different rights outlined in the Bill of Rights. So anytime you can take a boring technique and make it into a story, it's going to make it better for you. And I was just reminded of another idea. And our math teacher uses to teach about slope. And he actually, instead of just doing some boring thing out of the textbook or off the internet, he actually does a Barbie bungee jump. So they have Barbie dolls and Ken dolls and I think a Captain America, and each group gets one. And then they do a bungee jump with it using rubber bands. So they see how far does their character fall with one rubber band, how far with 3 rubber bands. And then they have to extend that slope off so that they do it off the top rail of the middle school and down to the first floor from the second floor. And it's something really, really fun. The students see the 8th graders doing it as 7th graders and 6th graders and 5th graders. And that's something that they're always looking forward to. They have no idea what the concept is until they get into math class, but they know that that's something fun to do. And it's a simple lesson on teaching slope. So kudos to Mr. Kleiman for taking that what could be a boring lesson and making it super engaging and super fun. And now all the kids have a story to tell about their Barbie bungee jump. So now we know why some curriculums might feel boring, and we've talked about different ways to cut the boredom. So let's talk about how to fight the resistance you're going to have from some of your students, because some students are going to come in with a preconceived notion. They're going to say, math class, this sucks, boring. History class, this sucks, boring. And I think one of the first ways you can help cut that is to acknowledge their feelings. And if you have a lesson that is particularly boring, be truthful with them and be honest and say, yep, this one's kind of boring, but it's something we have to get through so that we can understand the next part. So early in their 8th grade year, we do a lesson on the Boston Tea Party. And in order to do that lesson, I have the students line up on the tables and physically throw tea bags into the harbor, which is just my classroom. And the students really enjoy that. They enjoy the little video that goes with it, and then they enjoy raiding the desks. Who wouldn't, right? An 8th grader jumping on top of a desk and getting to throw stuff. It's like the best lesson ever. But I tell them, not every day can be a tea party. Some days we just have to grind and get in the 14th Amendment and read those words and figure out what everything means. Other days, we can set up our desks and protect the Alamo. But not every day can be that way. So if you go into a boring lesson and try to trick them into thinking it's going to be exciting, you're going to lose. But if you acknowledge, hey, this is going to be a little bit of a boring lesson, but it's something we got to grind through, I think your students are going to respect you more for it. You're going to build that relationship with them, and you'll be able to get through those drier lessons so you can get to the more fun ones. So another way, which is a little more difficult, that you can overcome resistance is you can give students a choice in how they engage with the material. And this can be a little difficult because if you have a project going on where someone's making a PowerPoint slide and somebody's making a poster and somebody's making an origami model of something that comes from the War of 1812, you're going to have a lot of different things to manage in your room. You could potentially have more behavior issues, and it could be more difficult in grading. However, something else you can do is give the students the illusion of choice, where you can offer them 2 or 3 options, where one option is obviously the best one, and you can actually kind of guide them into choosing that. So they may believe they had 2 or 3 choices on how they're going to complete this project, but you guide them into that one that you need. And now that they feel they had a choice, they're going to be a lot more apt to be engaged with the material and with your project. And the last thing I'll say about overcoming resistance is be funny, use humor and energy. You're dealing with kids, and kids like to be funny. There's a video I show as we talk about Western people and cowboys specifically, and it's from Weird History, which if you've never followed Weird History, they have some fantastic videos. But one of them is, what did the people of the Old West eat? And one of them is cow testicles. Well, if you want to see a group of 8th grade boys just lose their mind laughing, show a video that tells about people eating cow testicles, and all of a sudden that boring lesson just became a lot less boring. So anything you can do to bring up the energy level, bring up the humor level, as long as you can keep it down at that nice area where we're allowed to learn and not be totally crazy, you're going to help beat down that resistance to that boring curriculum. So every curriculum has its challenges, but as teachers, we have the power to bring it to life by connecting lessons to the real world, incorporating student interests, and using active learning techniques and telling stories. We can take even the driest material and make it engaging. Remember that your enthusiasm as a teacher is contagious. If you're excited to teach, your students are going to be more excited to learn. So thanks for joining this episode of Classroom Coffee Break. If you found this episode helpful, I ask that you subscribe and share with a fellow teacher so they can make the next Classroom Coffee Break. And remember, every lesson is an opportunity to spark curiosity and creativity. Till next time, keep growing, keep learning, and keep making a difference.